Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation on WPD's flexibility services and the evolution of some of our products and processes and services. On today's call, we got myself, Ben Godfrey. I head up distribution system operation for WPD, and also joined by my colleague Matt Watson. We're going to go through today's content, which is a summary of all of the aspects that we published in our evolution paper last week. This really sets out how we want to change and alter some of our products and processes, with the expectation that this will drive increased participation in the markets and also allow a greater level of competition across a number of different timescales. We've got lots of content to go through today, which is means we've got quite a tight schedule. So if I can ask for any questions to be directed through the chat, we should be able to pick those up as and when we go. And there's also a good period at the end of today's presentation to go through Q&A together. Separately to that, we're also I've got a workshop which is a bit more detailed for a week on Tuesday, and this will be guiding out some of the allow us to seek out further opinion and really inform our way of thinking. So these changes that we're going to be setting forward, we think are our kind of minded to position on how we wish to go and change our products and processes. But we're not looking for just lip service feedback to say these look good. We really appreciate some detailed challenge and review of some of these processes, because I think that way that we can really justify that we're doing these changes that we're putting forward will actually help and improve the market rather than change for change's sake. So all the questions are within that evolution of flexibility services document, and you can either feedback through today's session, feedback through our email address, or the session on the 30th with that more detailed workshop session. Good. Okay. So in terms of sort of why we're doing this, then WPD has quite a long, quite a wide role in terms of keeping the lights on and operating the network. And most of the things that we do as a distribution network operator, we've always done. So particularly keeping the lights on, maintaining equipment, fixing the network, and connecting customers. They're pretty bread and butter activities for us as a DNO. But crucially, the new area that we are developing more competence and really trying to expand our horizons on is about operating a smart system. And this will really be one of the key impetuses for driving towards net zero, is operating this smart system. We've had quite a lot of success to date in doing this. But it's quite a big challenge about moving from a passive network to an active network. And in order for us to really draw down the benefits of that, we need to develop competence in a number of activities, linking these processes together in order to actually deliver the sufficient amount of flexibility in the areas that we need it, and making sure that we have enough confidence to actually defer reinforcement and actually achieve those savings for consumers. So this is something that we've been doing over the past, say, sort of 4 to 6 years. We've had quite a lot of success in doing so, but we're ready to sort of take it to the next level. So since 2017, we've managed to contract over 700 megawatts worth of flexibility, and that has resulted in actual real savings through to customers and deferring £39.4 million worth of reinforcement. And we've done this at quite a modest cost. So we really think that we have the skills and the capability to deliver wider benefits. We just need to make sure that we're signposting in the right areas and also opening up those market opportunities. And this is really the crux of why we want to change some of the processes and the products that we've got and the way that we interact and procure those services, because we can see some small changes that will really open up greater levels of flexibility participation, and also increase the ability for competitive markets to compete across a number of different time scales. So by opening up these new opportunities and developing some of these products and processes, we think we can have a much more varied and competitive market. So I'd like to hand over now to Matt Watson, who's going to take a look into a bit more of the detail on our approach to flexibility products. You're on mute there, Matt.
There we go, double mute, the challenge with everything. So as Ben mentioned, I'm Matt Watson. I'm part of Ben's team. I look after a number of different areas, looking at sort of different flexibility products. Today I wanted to kind of cover a few kind of topics within this, but we're going to start with talking about kind of some of the new products we're looking to bring forth through this evolution paper. As Ben mentioned, it's all about really about trying to ensure that we have a sort of portfolio of products that give sensible routes to markets for a number of different providers to kind of increase the volume of flexibility available to us, so that we can then maximize the benefit to customers and really kind of drive value in competition. As Ben mentioned, we've been doing this for a number of years, so this is very much kind of building on learning that we've kind of gathered over time and feedback from customers to understand how we can kind of derive more value. And as Ben mentioned, we're really keen on your feedback. So both in terms of questions as we go along through this webinar, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end of this. And we're also really keen for attendance at the workshop next week and any other sort of feedback, because we're keen to kind of make sure this is as valuable as possible. So in terms of the products, before we launch into the new products, we thought it'd be good to start with setting out a bit of a framework for how we see most flexibility products working. So we've come up with this common process, and we see that there's a number of key stages that are that we see for a number of different flexibility products. They may do them at different points in time, but they generally follow the same similar process. And they start with us publishing our needs. So that's the kind of the most left-hand box. So this is about us telling the market, what do we need, where do we need it, when, and how we're looking to buy it. So very basic market information, kind of setting out what are our actual needs. We then, off the back of that, expect participants to respond with telling us how they're available, when they're available, and we get into this sort of green box, the sort of trade box, and we'll come back on that terminology later in the webinar. But this is effective when participants have given us a view of their availability, and we accept or reject it. So this is about us trying to ensure we have sufficient volume available to us on the network to manage our needs. Once we have that volume available, we then proceed into then considering their utilization. And we have this pink and purple boxes, where the pink one being where we potentially schedule and sort of start planning what our utilization requirements might be. So this is off the back of seeing what's available, understanding how we might want to use it going forward. And the purple box then being about us making the final decision about what that utilization will be and programming it in and making a final decision off the back of it. You'll notice that sometimes these two steps end up merging as we kind of discuss some of the products. And then finally, once we've kind of made the utilization decision, we then get into sort of the more operational side of things, where we're looking to dispatch assets, which we do via an API 15 minutes ahead of real time, and then we dispatch the service. So to kind of add a bit more flavor to what is quite an abstract concept, we thought we'd start by mapping out our current product suite against this. So we currently procure three products: Secure, Dynamic, and Restore. These align with with 3 of the 4 Open Networks products. For each zone, we procure either Secure or Dynamic as sort of the primary product, and Restore is procured in all 3. And our current process really focuses on a sort of a week ahead process. So if we walk through the diagram again, we kind of forecast our requirements, our long-term requirements at the sort of 6 months to 4 year ahead stage. These feed into our procurement cycles. But then closer to real time, sort of at the month ahead stage, we provide a more detailed forecast of what we're expecting to procure in the month ahead. We then get to the week ahead stage where we've collected availability from our providers. And this is where a lot of the kind of focus sits at the current process. So for our secure product, we see what availability is there. We accept or reject it at that point in time. And at the same point in time, we make a final decision on the utilization. So because it's a pre-fault service, because we have certainty about what our requirement is, at the same time as we're making the availability decision, we can make a decision on the utilization. And effectively from there, at that point, our requirements are relatively static, and we flow through into the operational phase where we send an instruction 15 minutes ahead of real time and dispatch. For the dynamic product, this operates slightly differently because of the different network requirements. Because we are less certain about our requirements, we still ensure that at the week ahead stage that we have volume available. So we go through that same trade process of making sure we have we've paid for availability, but ultimately we reserve the right to make that final utilization decision at the 15-minute ahead stage. So just as we're sending the dispatch signal. So between those two, we have the options to schedule, to plan what we think we're going to do, but we only commit to it at the 15-minute ahead stage as we send the utilization instruction. And then finally, for our restore product, because we expect it to be used relatively infrequently, we don't provide details of our sort of requirements at the month ahead stage. We go through a similar process at the week ahead stage where we accept all, at this point we accept all the volume because there's no availability fee. So effectively accept all volume, and then we dispatch on requirement in real time. So if that's kind of how we currently operate, I then wanted to kind of push into kind of where we see things moving forward. And this is and the focus here really is about trying to draw some of the timelines out. So we mentioned previously that we are currently quite focused on a week ahead process. The aim through some of these new products is to bring that forward to sort of a couple of months ahead process, potentially 6 months ahead. And this is sort of building on learning from a few different trials and learning from kind of operation of these assets, and looking at how we can try and improve potentially certainty for providers and also certainty for us as the procurer. So we have 3 new products that we're looking to launch in the next year. We have a sustain product, which is building on the learning from the Future Flex trial and specifically the sustain H element within it. So it's focused on domestic assets on a relatively simple scheduled service that we're looking to make to draw out. And then we're also developing sort of longer term versions of the secure and dynamic products. We're also making a few changes to restore, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So if we walk through this diagram, you'll see a lot of the boxes stay very similar to the previous one. The processes are very similar. The big thing that changes are the timings. So again, at the further sort of ahead stage, we are sending out initial forecasts of what our longer term requirements are. We then publish some more detailed requirements of what we intend to kind of secure that longer term basis. And at this time, say for the sustain product, we are making the availability decision and the utilization decision at that months ahead stage. So sort of 6 months ahead is when we're looking to kind of secure it all. And effectively from then on, once we've secured what we need to do at the 6 month ahead stage, it's just a case of everything is scheduled. We do send a 15-minute ahead dispatch signal. That's partly because we can technically. Participants aren't obliged to integrate with that. Effectively, it's scheduled further ahead and then expected for them to operate in real time. Our secure long-term secure product actually looks very similar to the sustain product. It's emulating a lot of what we are doing in the shorter term secure stuff as well. The key differential between the two is that because the sustain product is drawing from a fair amount of the learning from the sustain H trial, it is it's focused on domestic assets. There are a few simplifications that we've added to the process. So we're looking to aggregate requirements over a number of different zones. We're looking to fix pricing. There's a number of things we're looking to do to try and simplify things for domestic providers. Whereas secure, we're looking to still make decisions at that longer term 6-month ahead stage, but we're looking to make it quite targeted. So this should be accessible to larger assets as well. So at the 6-month ahead stage, we will be hopefully gaining availability requirements, making decisions on that, and then also committing to utilization. The final product is then the new long-term dynamic product, where again we've got the sort of longer term requirements. We're making the decisions on availability at that 6-month ahead stage, but this time we're then giving ourselves, like with the dynamic product that we currently have, we're giving ourselves until 50 minutes ahead of real time to do the final utilization decision. So effectively all we're doing is we're taking that availability decision, pulling that further ahead to allow us to provide both providers and ourselves a bit more certainty of on delivery. So alongside this, we see this kind of quite a big change, quite a shift, adding additional kind of around sort of revisions at the sort of 6-month ahead stage. On our restore product, we're looking to potentially facilitate both timeframes, so the week ahead and the 6-month timeframe through it. We're also going to be adjusting how some of the timings of the price setting for our existing products, but we'll come on to that later in the presentation. So with those new products, we then have actually a lot more potential combinations of products we could have in different zones. And so we want to kind of walk through how we're going to do that, how we're going to potentially look at kind of allocating volumes between them, and then also how pricing might work. So firstly, at the moment, we kind of generally have 2 styles of zones. We either have a secure zone or a dynamic zone. We are keen to retain that going forward, and effectively look to have either a zone where you have both secure long-term and short-term, or long-term and sort of current value, or you have dynamic with those two options. And then alongside those 2 core ones, we'll have a sustained product across all zones and the restore product across all zones. So effectively, we'll continue to have 2 styles of zones and not have too many different permutations. We acknowledge that once you have more than one primary service in a zone, we then have to be quite clear about how we allocate volumes between those services, to ensure that participants understand how we see value and can respond accordingly. So we'll be implementing some fairly basic processes at the moment to allow us to manage basic procurement risk, with the aim to, over time, to better understand both how the processes work, what risk we are exposed to, and look to build more complex and sophisticated systems to help us manage that. But it will be a learning and iterative process that as we kind of push out and learn, we'll kind of feedback, and we aim to be very transparent about how we're doing this volume allocation. We'll also be taking a few simple steps to start with. So for sustain, we will be simply accepting all volume initially in a bid to build up volume on the domestic side of things. And for restore, again, we will accept all as per our current processes. From a pricing perspective, we're also looking to see a little bit of an evolution. So our current pricing strategy has a number of different stages. We start with fixed pricing, where we feel that there isn't sufficient liquidity within the market, and then have a sort of multi-stage process to allow us to add more competition as we see more volume, as we see more liquidity. We aim to sort of keep the similar split between being able to kind of choose the style of pricing depending on liquidity, and we'll sort of keep a very similar process for deciding when zones are liquid or not. Once they are liquid, we'll move sort of out of fixed pricing into competitive pricing, looking to use pay as clear mechanics wherever possible. But we will look to keep both sustain and restore on fixed prices at the moment in the short term, so they won't have this sort of change. For sustain, that's very much again about building the market, trying to keep things simple initially. There may be a view that in the longer term that might transition to a more competitive product. For restore, we're expecting that to stay relatively simple with its fixed pricing, because we think that the due to its low utilization, the complexity that's added through competition sort of outweighs the benefits, but we will be reviewing its pricing to ensure that it remains a premium product. So if we kind of quickly walk through the different zones, effectively on our secure zones, we'll be effectively having one effectively competition at the sort of long-term stage where we have a certain volume required. We'll then look to pay as clear based on the utilization and the arming fee. We very much see that sort of in the long term that secure is probably going to transition to become a utilization only product. And so we're going to have quite a fixed kind of ratio between the two. So a participant would provide a single price and we will split between the two. We haven't made the change this year due to the complexities that adds on or the changes that makes to the payment mechanics, but that's where we're aiming to go. So we'd effectively have that submission of pricing for the long-term products, aiming to hit those volumes. And then at the week ahead, it would again be looking to hit the
things were going too smoothly there.
For the dynamic zones, utilization decisions, so effective for secure there. Do we lose me?
Yeah, back now.
An effect. Great, so I'll just cover the dynamic piece again. So effectively, there is a bit more interaction between the utilization parts of dynamic, whereas our secure products, effectively, we make a decision, commit to it at the 6-month ahead stage, and a separate decision followed on at the week ahead stage. For dynamic, inherently, both are making utilization decisions at approximately the same time. So we'll be looking to utilize what we're calling a joint utilization competition to try and get the services to interact with each other and generate competition. So effectively, the way we see this working is that at the sort of 6 long-term time frame, we'll put out our requirements both for sort of overall expected volumes and requirements that we're looking to procure in the long term. We expect providers, so long-term providers, to submit pricing for both availability and utilization at that point in time, and that would feed into a sort of a clearing where we look to use pay as clear mechanisms to award availability, so to ensure that we hit our requirements for how much we want to get in that sort of longer term auction or longer term clearing process. At the same time, we will also use the bids provided to cap utilization prices. So effectively off the bat, as part of the clearing process, we'll look at sort of which bids provide the best total value based on ratios that we will be publishing with providers, and effectively that will help us understand the value, and we'll use that to clear the availability and set a cap on utilization. When we get to the week ahead stage, that capped long-term providers will be given the option to either stick with the cap or provide an updated price, and that will sit alongside any pricing provided by the shorter term FSPs for both availability and utilization. So effectively, at that stage, we'll be looking to ensure we have sufficient volume for the total for our total requirement, and we'll look to do that in the most cost-effective way. So there'll be certain volume that will be there specifically for the short-term market, but there may be scenarios where we choose to take extra availability and utilization from the short-term market if it proves more cost-effective than utilizing providers in the long-term market. With all this, there's a lot of detail around all these processes. There's a lot of nuance, and these are really some of the areas where we're very keen to get people's feedback to understand how this works, how this will impact them, how it might operate in practice. And there's a lot more detail in the evolution document that covers this. And finally, we wanted to kind of highlight that within the document, we're trying to kind of cover 2 different timescales. So it is quite focused on the sort of short term, what we're going to do in the next regulatory year. But we also want to kind of give a view as to kind of where we expect things to go in the long run. So we expect to So there's kind of three key strands here. The first is around kind of rolling into closer to real-time timeframes. Many of you are probably aware of our Intraflex project, where we've been looking at procuring services close to real time through the nodes marketplace. I think the feedback from that has been overwhelmingly positive, and we see significant benefit to kind of operating in those timescales. We see value in being able to open up markets for assets that can't provide certainty further ahead of time. And effectively, so we see the value. I think we also see the complexity and the challenges of operating at those timeframes for us at the moment. While we won't be taking those forward immediately in this regulatory year, but we'll be focusing more on making sure we have the internal systems and processes ready to deploy in terms of business as usual. So the aim is this year is very much about enablement to ensure that we're in a position to roll those out as soon as possible. And you'll notice when we get into the section that's more about the processes, all those processes are built with an eye to closer to real time in the future. So we should really be in a position to roll things out in a relatively smooth way. And the second area that's probably worth mentioning is around how we're coordinating with the ESO. So we're involved in a number of different projects with the ESO about how we coordinate with services. One of them, for example, is the megawatt dispatch service we're doing with the ESO in the Southwest as part of our regional development programs, where we're looking to help them manage transmission constraints, contracting with assets connected to our network, and utilizing our control systems to help manage those as a simple and a first step into providing increased operability in the Southwest. We are interested to see how that develops, how we can maximize participation in that service, maximize access into that service, and maximize value to both ESO and DNO. We're also heavily involved in co-leading the Open Networks work on primacy rules, where we're looking again at rules around how we coordinate and co-optimize for services with ESO to ensure that we continue to facilitate markets and drive value for customers and develop rules that are clear and transparent that providers can understand. And then the final topic is around reactive power, where we are aware a number of our colleagues and the DNOs have been doing some work on this, and we're keen to reach out, kind of just see what they're doing, understand what they're doing, follow along with the work on the ENA, and see how we can, again, maximize the value from the learning that's being generated there. So that's my overview on the products. There's a lot in there to digest. The point of this was to kind of give an overview, give us some time to reflect, and we're really keen on your feedback both now and in the workshops. And I'm going to pass over to Ben, who's going to talk about some of the processes.
Good, thanks, Matt. So hopefully that's given a good flavour of the products and how we're introducing that new Sustain product to really target domestic flexibility, providing more longer term products to give some certainty in terms of the value and opportunity, but then also looking at how we can drive competition across all those different products and provide more opportunity for some of the value that might become apparent closer to real time to come through and provide that value back to the market. So hopefully that has given a good overview about how the products all fit together and some of the changes that we're making. I'm going to, as Matt says, I'm going to go through some of the flexibility processes, the sort of what's and whys and what we're doing. So one of the core things that we've been trying to do is ensure that our flexibility processes really fit together with some of the regulations that we're governed by, specifically the Utilities Contracts Regulation. So this governs how we procure many of our different contracts across assets and services as a utility company, and it's quite cumbersome in that it requires a certain level of standstill periods across the sort of pre and post tender window that we need to observe. So it builds, a certainty of process, but it does mean that we have to do things in a certain way. It can, and we have been able to accommodate it in our current biannual procurement timelines, but what we want to try and do is really design a very agile process for procuring that will allow us multiple times to run tenders and start. And so in our 6-monthly process, it's fine what we've got at the moment. But if we start looking towards how we might do things a little bit more regularly, if we were to squeeze the procurement timescales down to monthly, or even towards closer to real time, then the existing structure that we've got isn't very forgiving in terms of that approach. So we've now proposed and developed a few new processes that should speed up that process and also lower the cost of participation when we're looking at those particular interactions. So the new procurement processes really look to provide some standardization and consistency across some of the terms, particularly on qualification, contract award and trades. And by introducing these kind of new terms and providing a consistent way about how we're going to be taking in data and information from flexibility service providers, what sort of timescales and process they need to follow in order to become qualified or have a contract awarded. So providing that further information, we think that we can converge and arrive on some consistency that will enable some of these activities to be taken on by third parties. So particularly when we're looking at commercial qualification, then this is the chance for the flexibility service provider to complete the dynamic purchasing system information, register on that, and ensure that we've got all the sufficient details to go and get them fully registered. And then once that's complete, then there's an overarching tender that can be completed dynamically, and that allows, once commercial qualification has been completed, it then allows that next stage to be the next part of the tender to be completed, and then we can then follow through the processes in terms of notifying contract award and following those standstill periods. Once that overarching tender process has been completed, then you've then got the ability for the FSP to complete the technical qualification, which is a sort of separate separate process entirely. And once that has been complete, then we can sort of then move on to how the trades work. So this particular diagram here kind of sets out that contract award process. And then what we can see is that the FSP is now able to complete the technical qualification. And but in doing so, moving on to the technical qualification aspect of it, then the assets that they're technically qualifying are not linked through to that overarching tender or that previous commercial qualification. And that allows much more agility in terms of the technical assets that are being offered up to be able to form particular trades. This can be complemented by the signposting activity. So with the network operator putting out trade opportunities and receiving information from those FSPs on what capacity and ability that they've got to deliver services. That can then form into this kind of weekly trade process for the short-term products. And again, this follows a very similar process to the longer term, but just on different timescales. So in the shorter term, we've got this week ahead, day one stage where the trade opens. Invited parties, qualified parties are invited to be able to respond to that particular trade. And then we've got a set period about when we'd expect that kind of information to percolate through the systems, understand, who was able to offer what, with the trade awarded on day 4. And that enables us to lock in when we're expecting that service to be provided and contractually commit to that particular decision. So effectively releasing or signifying our commitment at that particular stage, which then flows into that operational delivery for the following week. Whereas on the longer term trades, then that happens over a much longer time period. So we'd really be having a kind of 6 monthly ahead period, similar to what we do now, whereby we release the tender information, we release the trade information about what we're seeking and the signposting. Then the trading window opens. We'd expect a much longer period for people to present their equivalent opportunities about what services they can provide. And then we would see a closing of that window, and then a locking down of the commitment from our side, which would then lead into the following window for actually delivery of that. So rather than in the short term, it's a kind of weekly process that we're following. In the longer term, it's a month-on-month process. And this is all facilitated by what we're determining an online procurement hub. So that is allows us to wrap up digitally all the information on commercial qualification, technical qualification, asset registration, and trade participation. And all that information can be exchanged either directly with flexibility service providers or through marketplaces or other third parties. And having all that information and that process digitized will enable us to interact directly with that information back into our database, and that will enable us to actually operate the system. So this is a new development sitting alongside the Flexible Power Portal, and it really streamlines the process of us receiving data and should help start standardize how we can allow some of these opportunities to be provided by third parties, and widening out the opportunities and routes to participation. And that is key really into how we see our processes and systems evolving into the interaction with other platforms. So we would like to see the way that we integrate with other platforms to be occur in a very similar way to how we interact currently with flexibility service providers. So we'll be able to give all the information about what the opportunities are and how that will work with those, and what the opportunities and what information we're seeking, and that can be served to us digitally, so that the handover can be very consistent. And be completed by those third parties. So on the diagram here, we've got our procurement hub as really being a huge enabler of those marketplaces, making sure that they've got the information that they need to be able to understand where the opportunities are, both geographically and time-based, and then wrapping that information up about what the flexibility service providers can provide, and pushing that back through to us through both the Procurement Hub and the Flexible Power Portal, so that we can then use that for our decision making and our award basis for the when we start coming into the operational phases. And we think that this really opens up the standardization of these data flows, and the standardization of some of these processes really open up the opportunity for secondary trading as well. So we're very shortly going to be looking to deploy basic secondary trading capabilities, which will allow kind of manual trades to occur. But through the digitalization of this data and the standardization of some of these processes, we think that we'll be in a position to be able to provide our view about what the requirements are, allow some of these trades, particularly on availability, to be locked in. And then between that availability is set accepted and all the way up to when the final utilization decisions are being made, then there is an opportunity there for secondary trading to exploit some of that value and look at other opportunities for others to be able to provide those services, and then ahead of the final utilization decision being pushed through from our control rooms, then that would signify the kind of market cutoff and lock down some of the who would be providing the services for an operational phase when we go into that. We're looking at that to be about sort of 2 days ahead of instruction at the moment, but obviously as we start getting more experience in real-time services, we could see that shrinking down. So the next slide really talks about some of the other more larger topics that relate to this, particularly on the grandfathering. So we encouraging existing providers to move across because we think these terms are very favourable, but we will commit to protecting existing contracts and dispatch to the expectations that we've already made if they don't. As I say, we think that these new contracts and the new processes are very much a step in the right direction for improving the agility about some of these services. So we'd like to bring legacy contracts forward into these terms, but completely respect the decision if some people don't feel that that's the right decision for them. But we'd very much like to hear and understand about some of that feedback through this consultation, informal consultation process. Non-delivery as well. Whilst we think we're doing the best thing in terms of providing additional commitment further up front on our longer term products, we'd also like to start seeing whether there's some equal commitment from the market and how non-delivery penalties might be perceived. So we'd be very interested to see whether we think that would incentivize people to operate in these markets, or whether it would be a barrier. We'd really appreciate some feedback on that. And then finally, timelines as well. So we're looking to try and deploy these changes in the next regulatory year. There's a few digitalization aspects that we're working on, and that really, could impact upon the delivery of that. So we'd like to see, whether people think that we're moving at the right pace, whether we could go quicker, whether we should go slower, and really get some feedback on that. Good. And then finally, we'd like to focus a little bit on the data sharing. So we think that this is one of the key requirements for opening up opportunities for third parties, and just providing a bit more visibility and transparency about what we're doing. We already share quite a lot of information on this. So our flexibility requirements are available through our connected data portal. We've got our network flexibility map, the flexible power map as well. Multiple procurement documents setting out what we've already awarded and what we're expecting to do. We've got our distribution network options assessment, which sets out the decisions behind why we've either gone for a flexible or conventional reinforcement approach. We've got our monthly forecasts that give a kind of 30-day ahead window of what we're expecting to do. All of these are going to be underwritten and improved by raw data on our connected data portal, and that really we'll be looking to really lead the industry in terms of how quickly and how regularly we can update that information. In terms of procurement results, then we've already been publishing those in line with our C31E month within procurement, but we want to start putting forward a consolidated view much further ahead about what we're be looking to procure, so that provides the maximised amount of visibility, and then starting closely to get a bit more visibility on operational data. In our procurement report, we're going to be looking at how more quickly we can, how more frequently we can publish this information, and the decisions behind that. And so we'd really be interested in seeking some feedback on, what sort of things you expect to be seeing in that, and how we can provide the best information to provide that visibility about what we're doing. Good. So hopefully you'll be able to see that we've got like a real rich selection of data already, but we're very keen to hear some sort of more questions. I think we've got a couple of questions that are coming already. We're going to pop in to go and asking those. But we're very excited to hear some of the feedback, either directly through our email address, reaching out to us bilaterally, through LinkedIn or otherwise. And also this workshop we've got on the 30th, that will be a real deep dive session. So if there's any sort of nuances that perhaps we've either glossed over today, or you'd like a little bit more information, please do take that opportunity to really engage with us.
Yes, and to point out that also in our evolution document, there are, as well as opportunities for you to ask questions of us, there's a number of questions we want to ask of you. There's quite a lot of quite specific questions where we understand there's a lot in this, and we're kind of very keen on your views on specific elements. So please do have a look through that document, look through the questions, see where you can add value to the design of these services. So in terms of questions, we've got a couple here. I wonder if I pick up a few of there's a few we can do fairly quickly, and then we can kind of launch into a few of the others. So there was one around whether we'll be accepting half-hourly metered data for the sustained product to sort of help encourage the domestic sector and community-owned flexibility products. The answer to that is yes. That's a nice, easy one. We will be. That's kind of something that came out of that we kind of accommodated through the Stay in H trial and saw that as quite valuable. So that will be being taken forward. There's a question here around contract lengths and how we see those working with longer term products. Do you want to take that one, Ben, or do you want me to give that one a shot?
So for the contract lengths, what we've been doing so far is allowing up to 4-year contracts to be awarded based on the participant themselves choosing the best period of contract length to do so. We think that will persist into the future, particularly as the new process that we're setting out will very much act like a framework. So we'll be setting out the kind of overarching contract to be able to be commercially qualified and able to participate in the technical qualification. That will be sort of standard and set apart and could last, a much longer period. And then in terms of the technical qualification and the actual forming of a trade, we expect that to be a much more agile process. So you wouldn't necessarily be locked into a particular position through that longer term tender. Anything to add on that, Matt?
Yeah, I think the important bit to kind of highlight around the process now is a real kind of, is designed to split out the sort of the formal procurement UCR compliance element, and takes that forward, gets it out of the way, and that's expected to be quite an enduring process. And then a lot of the focus is then about the trade, where lots of the interesting, the price setting happens, the volume requirements will all happen around this trade. And so you kind of have certain elements kind of go into the sort of longer term procurement that hopefully will last longer, but then we've got a lot kind of tied into the sort of the trade that either happens at the sort of 6-month lease stage or the week ahead. And that's where a lot of the core requirements around pricing and volume sit in. So it's kind of it's moving in different directions, but hopefully some really interesting stuff there.
Got another question there on the ESO DSO sort of interaction, which perhaps I'll sort of pick up on. So we've got 700 megawatts in contract, although that's geographically spread across the whole of our region. We're starting to go and get to the volumes and the dispatch level whereby there definitely is an impact on the transmission network. We're changing the boundary flows at that particular point. And so clearly that is something that we need to be providing visibility to the ESO and working with them on exactly how that works. So, traditionally we've been We work very closely with the ESO in terms of forecasting what our kind of demand peaks are, and making sure that we've got a network that works is secure in terms of what transmission capacity is there available, and making sure that we're coordinating the flows on our network alongside the flows on the transmission network. This is no different. We're still going to be working together on that sort of aim, but it allows us to have a much more granular approach, to be an active approach to actually changing what those flows are onto the network. So really much of the information that we're setting out in terms of what opportunities there are into the market is very useful information for the ESO to be able to understand what demand side flexibility might be doing in the WPD region in particular locations, and making sure that that is not going to that is going to work in sort of synergy with what's happening on the transmission network, rather than working against. And that kind of brings us nicely onto to the other question there we've got on the megawatt service, which perhaps Matt, you might be able to talk a little bit about, and some of the primacy work that we're working with.
Yeah, so a lot of this is around kind of interactions with the ESO. I think I'll pick up the primacy one because it kind of relates to the interaction with the ESO, and then megawatt dispatch. So yeah, tied to kind of how we interact with the ESO, we are working quite heavily on through the Open Networks product around to develop some primacy rules. So this is about trying to understand that, yes, inherently, as both as different organizations try to interact with assets on the distribution network in an active way, there are potentials for conflict, and therefore we need to develop the processes and rules, and some processes and rules to understand how to best interact and how to maximize value for the wider system. So the Open Networks product is just getting to the stage where we are sort of finalizing the key use cases. So the sort of next report should be due out in sort of end of November, early December, and should be highlighting the sort of key use cases we'll be looking forward, and some of the key principles we're developing around primacy. And then we'll be very much kind of jumping into the detail of how do we actually, picking a few of these use cases, how do we actually interact? So how do we share the right data with each other? How do we then, once we have that data shared, make the right decisions to get the right outcomes? It is quite a large and quite a complex topic, but there's quite a lot we can do to sort of to increase, to kind of improve on where we are now. And we'll sort of iterate and learn as we go along and improve things, which kind of leads nicely into the sort of megawatt dispatch piece, and kind of what we're doing with the ESO there. So one of the use cases we'll actually be looking at, and so this is kind of going through the regional, one of the use cases will be kind of this megawatt dispatch service, where effectively we, to enable further connection in the southwest, through the RDP work, the ESO assessed that actually it would be more cost effective to operationally manage distribution assets rather than build new transmission systems in the short to medium term. And so the megawatt dispatch process is a way of facilitating that, of allowing providers to give operational visibility and commercial control to the ESO. And effectively, the megawatt dispatch process is a simplified route to the provision of service using DNO control systems. We actually did a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago. It should be up. In fact, we've done 2 over the last few months. They should be on the ESO website. But the aim is very much to allow to create another option to provide visibility and commercial control. Currently, you can do that through the balancing mechanism or through the wider access program. This is a scheme that's very much at the other end of the spectrum, trying to do things as simply as possible so that it is easy and accessible. And over time, we hope to then kind of understand how those are used and whether there are requirements for other ways of accessing, of providing transmission constraint management services through different styles of services, or potentially also through having the DNO potentially access these services to gain further value. So there's a lot of interesting work being done on that, and there's lots of there's some webinars that have recently been held on that.
Yeah, I think those webinars are recorded and available to view on the ESO Regional Development Programme webpage. But essentially, we've been able to connect more generation down in the southwest by following this particular approach, and this is just helping the ESO tap into provide an alternative route for tapping into some of the flexibility that might be afforded by distribution connected generation. So more market opportunities for those smaller players. There's another question here on the overarching tender and what that might what might incur around that sort of tender. And I think as Matt said before, the crucial thing around this particular new process that we're setting out is that the commercial qualification and then the overarching tender is very much about ensuring that we are contracting with parties who can deliver a service, can integrate integrate with our systems to be able to provide those particular dispatch services, and the pricing comes later on and is separate into a kind of trade, into our trade process. So I think if you think about it, separating the kind of qualification of being able to operate on the stock market with actually trading and buying and selling shares, and it's a similar type of thing with what we're trying to set forward with flexibility, is that we want to ensure that we've got sufficient people to who are properly qualified and can operate in that particular market, but once they are sort of greenlit through that process, then they are able to compete within other participants who are also qualified to offer the services at the particular trade timescales that we really wish to put forward, both on a longer term basis and also on a shorter term basis. And I think that should set set us nicely up for real time operation as and when that comes forward too.
Great. And shall I just pick up the last question that was on flexibility, carbon intensity of flexibility services, and whether that will be in the procurement statement. So the guidance for the procurement statement is still, or procurement report is still in draft with Ofgem, but the expectation is that there will be a requirement for carbon intensity reporting. The view is that for the first iteration of the report, we will be developing a basic methodology, a sort of a first pass, and then next year through Open Networks we should be developing a common methodology across DNOs for the development of this. So yes, there will be stuff. The initial version will be a sort of first pass from the different DNOs, and there may be some variance in how we do it, but the aim it would be that by the end of next year we have a common process to move forward with on that. But yeah.
Excellent. I think that sort of wraps up the questions that we've been offered up and takes us nicely to 3 o'clock as well. So I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. Really good to see so many people on the call. We've got another opportunity for the workshop on the 30th, so if there's any sort of more nuanced questions you want to ask there, please do register to attend that. We can go down to a deeper dive. Similarly, if you'd like to provide any sort of feedback, there's an online form to answer some of the consultation questions. But if there's any other feedback you want to offer us bilaterally, chuck us an email across to WPD flexiblepower@westernpower.co.uk, or get in touch with us via LinkedIn or some other method. So thanks a lot for your attendance and your time. We wish you good well and hope to see you at some of our next events. Thank you.
Thanks.